Everyone. Welcome back. This is the promised follow-up interview. So now we're going to talk about Brandon's book, his new graphic novel that came out, Rain Like Hammers.
And Rain Like Hammers is serialized as a monthly book from Image Comics from 2020 up until the last issue came out in April. Is that right? And then the publication came out in July.
Yeah, that sounds right.
And Carson,
Yes.
I'm throwing it to you. What a fantastic book, Brandon. I love the heck out of it. Let me just go ahead and just say that right off the bat. If you guys have not read this yet or haven't read Brandon's work, really fantastic. And just from a purely visual standpoint, I mean, incredible use of clean line, really nuanced color. And, we were kind of all grousing about the idea of colorists as a particular American phenomenon. Well, Brandon shows what you can do with the artists themselves using the color in a narrative sense, and really blown away by it, and really enjoyed the heck out of it. So, how'd you do that, Brandon?
Thank you. Yeah, it was an interesting experience to make Rain Like Hammers general, and it's strange because I'd kind of been off shelves for a couple of years, and it's a weird return because it is kind of I feel like it's both a departure from my previous work and kind of me trying to boil it all into a new thing. The coloring thing is interesting because I have a hard time when I do my own work kind of separating the different factions of it, the coloring and the lettering and everything. This one has confusing notes on the credits here. Like my friend Alejandra is noted as the color editor, and what she did is she helped me get the lettering basically corrected for print, so it wasn't all 100% on every channel.
Okay.
I'm still very kind of new at figuring out. It's funny, I've been doing this for professionally for 23 years or something, and I'm still figuring out how printing works.
Right.
That's why we have Sean. Thank goodness, because I would have no idea. How do you say you feel like it's a big departure? I'm curious, because visually it's a refinement of what you've done before, but I don't think it's a big departure.
Oh yeah, I think visually it's pretty close. Just my two big books prior to this that I wrote and drew everything on were King City and Multiple Warheads, and they're both very pun based and very jokey. And this thing, I think there's still puns in it, but just it's almost like reflex. It's not like I purposely put in jokes and puns in the way. I mean, even the page you're on now has got like a person with an ear who can't hear someone. Their head is an ear and they can't hear someone. So there's definitely in there, but it was like my attempt to do something serious and not be like juggling for the audience for the reader on every page.
Okay. And so the reasons I really wanted to follow up talking about Appleseed and how like philosophical I knew that was going to get is I felt like this work was more personal and emotional, and then had a lot of very deep topics that you were poking at kind of implicitly about the philosophy of identity. So sure. I'd like to get into that eventually. But actually, some of the things that I wanted to ask about, Sean had different things that he wanted to talk about. But you talk about that you were kind of really, when I would see people talk about you, that's one of the things they talk about is like 5 million puns a page. And that was something the fan base was and really is into. And you do continue it. So this is from 2 different pages here. I just kind of put them together, but you go through a series of puns or using words. So he's using his nose to analyze the smell, and then you create this new term fartography instead of cartography. And
it's really blowing my idea out of the water that this is my introspective deeper work.
Yeah, well, yeah, sorry. And then something about this stinks.
This is fairly early on in the book.
I am curious, and then here you do more a visual version later in the book. where you have not a pun, but you play with language. So you have this construct of she, he, and then here you reverse. So you have in and out, and you like flip the black and white. So it's like the negative space.
Oh yeah. I tend to think of that stuff. It's like I guess it is wordplay, but it's not meant to be funny.
Mm-hmm.
But it's tied to the pun. So it's tied to the idea of like entendre and double entendre, but then you're making visual entendres almost. And so I was very curious about that, because it also seems to be, and I've talked to you about this before, that I really like this one essay you wrote about how tangents were good. And then you had Adam Warren respond about how bad tangents are, but you use them like right here, where you'll tie a page together by having a line apparently cross boundaries. So there seems to be a common strategy in there of linking unlinked things to compress more meaning into what you're doing. And like, I wonder if that's intentional, that's something that's attractive to you, or is this is just what your brain's doing?
I mean, well, it's funny that that page you had of all the computers in there, that was a totally unintentional tangent, but that's part of my guideline with tangents. Is I always feel like I'm so influenced by, by other comic books and animation and things like that, that my guideline always has to be reality, and tangents just exist in reality. And it's like, you don't want to purposely do them all the time, because they can really mess with the storytelling and mess with how you communicate with things. But I think the idea that you have to avoid this thing constantly that exists in reality doesn't make any sense to me if we're trying to talk about reality in the work. And also on the flip side of that, you can use tangents to draw the eye in ways that avoiding them, it's just like a tool that you're losing if you don't even engage with it.
One of the things that was interesting, it's sort of in line with the very small visual puns, is that there is a kind of, I would say, like a graffiti quality to the sort of accumulation of visual that you have in a lot of the segments. This is a fairly good example here, but I guess I've always kind of associated your work a little bit with sort of graffiti culture and
Sure.
tag culture, and it's almost like you've tagged your own pages and your own lettering with sort of little additions. Is that a like sort of overall strategy that you have, a part of a larger strategy that you have, or just something that you enjoy visually?
Yeah, I mean, it's probably just how my brain works in relation to stuff, where something I really liked when I did graffiti, and it's funny, I feel very out of touch with it because I haven't really gone out and written on things since I was in my early 20s. But something I really liked is doing a drawing and having it change because of the surface and because of the thing you were drawing on. Like if you tag a billboard and you are making it kind of a joke off of what's already there, it becomes like kind of a fun back and forth. And so a lot of the stuff in this, it's like I'm looking at reference of things, and sometimes it can be like one of the tricks that I would do when I did King City is I would just work with a stack of magazines, and I'd be drawing the city and be going through and be like, here's a billboard that's based off of a perfume ad and a cosmetology issue I'm looking at. And I would make a joke off of that in the thing, and the reader wouldn't necessarily need to see the thing I'm making a joke off of because it's kind of just filler for me. So right. I think there's a bit of that. I get really into collage in some scenes in this. I do it pretty lightly, but the pages you're on here is a thing where I just found, some pictures of Alaska or something and Photoshop them in. And I'm always surprised. I think I picked it up from the Jamie Hewlett, the Tank Girl Gorillas guy. He would do some collage stuff. And I'm always surprised with how good scanning and printing technology is now, that it doesn't happen more often, because it's such a, it feels very like a cool way to show more than I could draw. Like I could maybe draw something that looks close like reality in that, but I think it allows for things past my own abilities to throw the thing in. And that was a big epiphany for me when I was younger, is realizing that, like, with the introduction of using reference and and researching things, is you don't have to reinvent the wheel every time. You can have a core idea and take things around you to kind of express it.
Right, and you have definitely like the people who are novices at making something have that kind of lunatic extreme where they think they need to draw every chair. You know, they need to be, in order to draw a chair that a character is sitting on, that they need to actually, you know, make up a blueprint of it or whatever. And
yeah, it's frustrating that that's even a conversation still, because it's such a dumb baby idea, for lack of a better word.
You've got some
referencing.
What's that?
Is that what you mean? Like that photo referencing is cheating is a baby idea?
Yeah, it's like you just don't, you know, it's just how art works. We're pulling from reality, and so the idea that you should pull from reality without looking at reality seems very silly.
Could you give us a brief sketch of where this story takes place? Because I was trying to form that in my head, and I was like, you know,
you mean like the physical where it is?
Yeah.
I guess it gets really into the weeds, but basically it's an estranged colony of Earth, like a solar system that's been colonized hundreds of years ago and then kind of cut off from Earth and the rest of human society. And so it's kind of creates this as kind of feudal system outside of that. And most of the story happens on an artificial, like man-made planet. It has a artificial intelligence thing called the All Child that's at the core of the thing.
And it's not giving away too much to say that a lot of the raw plot involves people inhabiting each other, and that one of the main characters that we're introduced to is a criminal of some type. He is able to transfer into another person in order to commit an act that we're not sure exactly what he's going to do at first, and that has consequences for all of the people who are involved in those kinds of transfers. And when Carson's saying that there's a philosophical underpinning to the entirety of the story, I think that that's probably one of the bigger ones that you get into.
Yeah, and we can backpedal more about, or we can go back about kind of my core for, because initially I was going to do, so the first issue of this starts on a desert planet with these kind of walking cities. They're just basically these big cubes with elephant legs on them that walk around. And it's kind of like I was basically experiencing depression and trying to figure out how to write a story about what it felt like to be depressed and kind of have everything around you that you need, but not really being happy about it. And as this story went on, I kind of got into like I'd written about that. I'd had this idea, I was holding on to it for years, and then I'd gotten into another rough patch of my life and figured a way to take this story and expand it. And so I did the weird thing in it where the first issue and the last issue have a character that shows up, but he's not at all in the middle 3 issues.
I really want to ask about that. So I have this on the screen. This is Eugene, right? That's his name.
Yeah.
And so I got to be honest, I'm really glad I didn't read this as single issues, because I probably would have totally forgot about this first chapter by the time I got to the 5th one, and then felt like this guy came out of nowhere. So the first issue is the dissatisfied guy just going through life, right? The thing I found very interesting about the dissatisfaction here is that he seems to have worked really hard to get to where he's at, and then found that place to be unsatisfying. And I was curious about, because it did seem personal, like it was coming from a place, like, was there something, in your experience, I'm assuming as an artist, because I've had similar things where you work so hard to get to a certain point in your career, and then you're like, oh man, I'm still kind of bummed out, but I maybe feel guilty that I feel bummed out in an enviable position. And I kind of sense that in the first issue. So I'm interested to hear about that.
Yeah, very much. I did a little diary comic in kind of the back of the book that talks about it a little bit, but I was in this situation where I was living in Vancouver, BC, Canada, and I was working on the Rob Liefeld's relaunch of his Prophet series. And I was doing it as the only time I've ever really done like a monthly series I think I did for about 5 years. And I had like a nice-ish apartment living on the beach in Vancouver, and I knew I was married at the time, and the woman I was married to lived on the other side of the city, which is a weird situation. And so I was just like alone in this neighborhood, with a lot of work to do and not really much of any kind of a support system or friends or anything. So I had these things where I just kind of walk around the beach in these neighborhoods and then get home and be like, now I get to do this comic that I've worked my entire career to be able to do. And you know, my life was, you know, I had everything, but I was, you know, I think I was pretty miserable, and I was very confused for why I was so miserable. Vancouver's a very weird city in that the downtown is kind of not the cultural center of the city.
Apocalyptic.
Yeah, it's a little. I always expressed it as like, it felt like a video game where you haven't unlocked the levels yet. So it was like I'd walk through these streets and I'd be like, what a cool building that I cannot go inside, you know. You know, and there wasn't really there wasn't a lot of places to go, or I would walk to the library a lot. But yeah, so just kind of expressing that, and the story kind of evolved into an interesting thing, because initially it was going to be for Dark Horse Presents, and I think they had an 8-page limit. And so I was like, I don't think I can fit this in 8 pages. And I talked him into making it like 11 pages. And I just kept kind of turning down this idea of it fitting into that. And then by the time I actually did it as an issue, it turned out to like, you know, it's like 50 pages. Because I think I really wanted to express how it felt to just this repetition and boredom, which is weird because you're asking people to buy it for entertainment. So I was also trying to find ways. Like he has his TV show that he watches, and that's the thing with all the fart puns and that thing. And that's probably why it's so jokey in comparison to other stuff. But I tried to make it fun, and like him really figuring out his stuff, and a lot of things in science fiction one of the things I really like about science fiction is it allows you to show something visually and make it feel like different than it looks in reality. Like, I don't think I'd be as interested to read a comic book about a guy who just worked in an office cubicle, but if you make it you make it a weird robot that he's in with a weird shaped computer, and he's got his TV shows he watches, and he's got his that was another big part when I lived in Vancouver, BC, that I talked about, is they film a lot of TV shows there. So one of the things to entertain myself I would watch shows filmed in Vancouver and then go to the locations that they were filmed. And it made the city feel like there was more exciting things going on there than just them filming TV shows.
Sure, that's the roof that Batman killed that dude at.
Exactly.
And he talks about that, right? That the TV show he loves is filmed in the city that he had trained in before he moved to the city he's currently in.
Yes,
and that's part of his connection to the show.
There's you evoke the space so well. There's this deep space thing that you do throughout the book, not just in the opening segments where we were talking about it in relationship to Appleseed, where you really pull back and give us, just a tremendous, view of the space that they're in. It's a quite effective use of cartooning.
Thanks.
Hella expensive when we have the Netflix adaptation of this, Brandon.
Yeah,
that's going to be on the chopping floor.
I think that's something really fantastic about comics. I think about a lot is basically what looks like a big budget, like what would, like in the 90s, I feel like the comics books that were the American comics that were the most successful almost felt like B movies. Like you look at like a Jim Lee's Wildcats or something, and it's all close-ups of pretty people. It feels like you're watching like a Skinamax movie.
Right.
But then you look at like, something like Akira, and it's these giant expansive things, and it's just like, it didn't cost any more money to make. It was just time was what they're putting into it, or different thing of resources. So I mean, that's the thing I always try to focus on is aside from just drawing big weird things, is also like, what can I do in this comic that is specific to the medium? And that probably goes back to why I do different like language, playing with language and things like that, is that you can only do certain things in comics.
Well, it seems like his device that is that he uses for comfort, which Carson has a panel of that earlier, is a pretty good example of a comics only type of effect. I mean, you can imagine some way to sort of transliterate that into another medium, but this is a very, intriguing painterly device. Is there a particular thing, like a particular object that set off this idea for you?
I mean, so the idea of this device that he has is basically a recording of alien sounds. And so it's basically would sound like music, but I didn't want to use musical notes because those feel so human.
Right.
So it was like, they're just little brush strokes that I made in different colors.
Right.
But yeah, just and the idea that he's trying to figure out and just like artistically, it was really fun for me to kind of create a question for myself where he has this weird thing and he doesn't know what it is. And over the course of the thing, I was like, do I know what it is? You know?
Well,
to me, it's another like this. It's another, the reason I pulled this is I think it's beautiful. When I flipped to it, I was like, oh, this is such a great use of, a word balloon, to be so painterly within it. But the idea too of like, I don't know if this is a poem or a song or a game. It seems to be another one of those examples. And I think the collage stuff too is this constant budding of trying to like squeeze more juice out of something and not having it just, and maybe the identity stuff too is like, it's not just one thing. It's like a synesthetic experience where the music also has a like registers a color inside of you, or like you can make one word mean multiple things. That same thing, like this music he's listening to isn't just a song. It registers as multiple different things. And I'm fascinated by that because it shows up again and again in your work. And I've always loved that kind of stuff, but never been so good at showing it. And I feel like you're constantly showing me that in your work.
Thanks. I mean, I think a big part of it is, I mean, certainly in dealing with a lot of depression, you come across a lot of feelings of like, what does anything mean? And so just having things in art where you're trying to figure out the meaning is kind of helpful for me. And maybe the conclusion is nothing means anything, but it could mean different things, which is nice.
And like where you butt them up against each other and rub them is where the meaning comes from. It seems like your brain is constantly trying to do that, trying to generate that meaning.
Oh yeah, solving problems out of things that don't necessarily have answers. Yeah, it's weird. And this book was very weird because I, even explaining like when I was trying to explain where the setting is, it gets so convoluted because I have all these like science fiction ideas I want to express, plus trying to show emotions. And I was constantly hitting these walls where I got to work with an editor once I kind of had the second and third issue going. And constantly I would go to her and be like, does this make sense? Like, am I just handing you just a bunch of scribbles on paper, or is this a readable object?
Well, I was wondering if you had been influenced in your work on writing Prophet, because it was apparent to me as I was reading how much more backstory you seem to have on each of these elements than is actually present on the page. Including the maps and some of the pullbacks where you get an idea of the scope of things that it's not accessible directly in the narrative of the story. So I guess to phrase that as a question, were you influenced by having to did you feel like you had to just sort of justify things a little bit differently in Prophet, where, you're writing for a longer time scale and, writing for maybe a different audience?
Yeah, I mean, it's probably a similar audience maybe, but it's, because I don't know who, like it's interesting. Comic books, it's like, 6 or 10,000 people is who read my stuff, which is a giant mass of people, but it's, you think about like how many people see Invincible or something like that. Yeah, no, Prophet was a big influence because a lot of what I was writing on that is I was basically trying to kind of almost skip over the explanation of stuff, where it's like you have, clone space alien warrior guys, and it's like I feel like people have watched enough or read enough kind of science fiction with the tropes where you can kind of skip over the tropes and be like, this stuff, here's what happens next. And I try to do that a lot, and I think sometimes it's almost, especially with science fiction, almost becomes this thing of like showing a tree and knowing how the root system works, but you don't get to, no one else sees the root system, but yeah, you can kind of imply it by showing a bump of the root coming out of the ground or something. So it's like I want to figure out all the internal logic about why I'm doing things in a story, but yeah, it would almost be too much to try to show everything. And a lot of it you don't have to figure out yourself. You can just be like, what kind of things would visually show up if you have an artificial planet or something like that? Right. And like there's a bunch of things in there. Like I show at the starts of some of the chapters, I show these kind of almost like Greek arcs in space floating.
Mm-hmm.
Those show up but a lot of that, and there's all these maps that show up, and a lot of that was me being like, how do these people get from planet to planet within the scope of the story, and it just doesn't take them a decade to move? Right. Yeah, that thing. and it's
you
just
have an arc.
Yeah, a lot of that was there's a science fiction series that my mom read as a kid that was C.J. Cherith's Gates of Ivoriel, and it's basically about these gates. It's a very kind of tropey science fiction idea. I think they do it in Star Trek, where you have all these gates that are basically like wormholes that you jump to another place that are built by an ancient alien race that they don't know it is. So I just put those in there as like a little like my own internal logic for how they get from place to place and still make it work within the time frame of the story. And I didn't really, I think I kind of mentioned it a little bit in the story, but I didn't go into the history of that or explain it because I don't know if it's really necessary to the reader to know all that stuff.
Yeah, it's apparent that you know those things, and reading it, you have that sense. I had the sense as a reader of deep space and deep time, that you have enough of those textures to kind of convince it. But it does seem like that's a divide of certain types of creatives, and there are definitely people like certain kinds of novelists who don't seem to have any visual imagination at all, and don't seem to perceive a need to have that kind of like deep relationship with the events. They're like, well, I wrote it. That's the thing that happened. That's what he said. I don't know, especially like a non-visual novelist. Sometimes it seems as though like the engagement with what's actually not on the page is like fairly low, unless what's not on the page is thematic of nature instead of physical.
Interesting. Yeah. A lot of it is you probably just can't control what you think works. It doesn't work. Yeah, it's weird. Something I don't know why I'm thinking about this, but like something that I always see writers talk about that always frustrates me very much is the idea of when somebody's just like, I started off and then the characters just wrote it themselves. And I feel like everything for me is like this architectural fucking endeavor where I'm just like, I have no idea what this character is going to say, but let's write down 20 things they might say and pick the best one.
So is there a lot of pre-page, like before you get to laying out pages and stuff, do you fill notebooks with world building things, drawing machines and figuring out the gates and all of that? Or is it just you're figuring out the logic of the world as you get to the scene and like, oh shit, I need to explain how they get there. Okay, I'm gonna put a gate.
Yeah, it's more I've described it before as sometimes writing comics for me feels like you have a broom bounced on your hand and trying to run around the room with it, and you kind of have to go where gravity's taking the broom more than where you want to go. It's frustrating because it's like a lot of it is just this sheer terror of being like, is this good at all, or does this make sense at all to anyone? And sometimes I think it does, and sometimes it doesn't. But the risk, I had to make a bunch of rules for myself when I was doing Railing Hammers because it was because I wasn't just talking about depression. I was like in depression when I was making the vast majority of the book. And it was this like, I don't want to draw. I don't like drawing anymore. How do I still make myself draw? And that became one of the weird things about like over the course of doing this 5-issue, 50-page an issue series, I kind of figured out how to like making comics again. But it's a weird thing to ask people to read your process of that. So,
But well, you did it better.
It's a delight, I don't think it's a chore as a reading experience. I think it's delightful. But what were you saying, Carson? I'm sorry, that crosstalk.
Yeah, it's hard in an interview like this. We both have. There are people who make their story about that, though. And I've complained about that before. Like, there's nothing I hate more than the autobiographical comic about the stuck creator that's show themselves sitting at their drawing board having no ideas, and then they start drawing themselves sitting at their drawing board having no ideas. So I didn't get the sense that you hated making comics in this at all. I definitely got the sense that this was coming from a place of depression, and I also got the sense, and again, something I've experienced, that the depression gets worse when you realize you're in an enviable spot, because then you beat yourself up for how dare I be depressed in a situation. People like the Eugene character has studied hard to get to where he's at, and then he gets there and he's still depressed.
Yeah, it's funny. I'm always I don't know if it's just narcissism or what, but I've never thought of myself in an enviable spot because I often feel like I don't have guidelines for where to go next, and that's always very confusing to me. I don't know if I have I would constantly, in the past, I would constantly find myself put on like panels and stages with a bunch of people who are millionaires, and very successful. And I'd be like, why do I not have next month's rent if I'm talking, And so a lot of it is like personal frustration where it's like, I'm never going to be the guy that sits at a desk and like, what am I going to draw next? Because I do have a lot of techniques built up for how to get myself to do the next thing. And I don't have to reinvent the wheel. So I could literally just sketch a bunch of photos of things or write down something. A writing technique that I actually talk to my friends about a lot is the idea of reading something or watching something and making it active and not passive, where you write down how you feel about it. So you read a comic book and your relationship to it is you write down, this is my relationship with this comic. This is how I feel about it. This is how this comic makes me feel. This is what annoys me about this comic, what I like about this comic. And it becomes kind of an active thing where you're making creative work in relation to that. Yeah.
That frees the floodgates for you. Just the act of making something, even if it's responsive to something else.
Yeah, because everything's going to be responsive to something else on some level. So it's kind of how much you allow it to be.
Carson and I have talked a lot about. I have a pet theory that you have two different modes of creative engagement. One of which is responsive, and one of which is constructive. And that the constructive mode, if you think about the lunatic extreme of it, as an architect who sits down and says, "This is the function. What can I do to arrive at this function?" And the responsive is the person who arrives at the architect's building and takes their spray paint out and says "fuck you" and writes it on the wall.
Sure.
I don't know. Like there are aspects of this book that definitely seem of the constructive variety, where you have built a framework for yourself, and then you are building inside of that framework, or you've made a background for yourself or a map for yourself, and then you're building on top of this scaffolding on the previous work. And then the other responsive aspects of it, including like the jokes and puns and things like that. I mean, you really do see, maybe it's just the reader response, but there do seem like there are segments where you are awaiting to see what's going to happen. It feels fairly dangerous to me. There's a scene where your main character, the thief, gentleman thief, has switched bodies, and he's serving these upper crust people, and he finds his body responsive to them. He needs to serve them, and he has to fight that serving instinct, and he trains himself with this device that he's going to use to steal somebody's finger, which seems like a fairly implausible plot point, but he thinks he's going to do it, and he trains himself on it. And then when he actually goes to do it, he's at this party with all these aristocrats, and he goes to do it, and he chops off 4 of her fingers simultaneously, and all 4 fly into the air and are landing in different places, and they're all splayed out, and they're all numbered by you, the cartoonist. And that really felt like a dangerous, but somehow inevitable moment to me. That I don't know, the responsive art aspect of it. I mean, I could almost imagine you as the writer arriving at that situation, not sure exactly what it was that was going to transpire, but maybe I'm totally incorrect.
No, that is very accurate. And it is one of those situations where I kind of, it got away from me, and I had this whole idea of like, I always fall into these dumb tropes where I'm like, okay, this is going to be a heist. And I'm like, what about a heist is me processing depression, but then I've like set that up in the story. So I'm like, how do I engage with this in a way that feels authentic and is accurate? And a lot of it is just like that guy, having Brick Block prepare for his future. And another big thing about it that's a big part of it is, what part of it is I knew these neurophilosophers years ago. They were my ex-wife's aunt and uncle, or neurophilosophers that kind of study morality in voles, where they would inject vasopressin and basically these kind of like dopamine chemicals into these animals, and see how monogamous they were with these things added or taken away. And it really struck me at how much a lot of what we do as people is chemical things that we either have to fight against or go with. Yeah, I might be getting off the rails a bit on this thing, but a lot of it's just like I aside from kind of depression, I had a lot of anger problems growing up, And so a lot of me figuring out how to act in how to function in society is about me not reacting to my kind of chemical urges.
So that's actually on the rails of totally some of the things that I responded to most in the book, is that combination. So like on the way to that portion of the book, you do a like just jump from issue 1 to with the Eugene character that seems to be dealing with the depression aspect to the brick block character, which is this fellow here. And it's a totally different story where he crash lands. I didn't take it as he was trying to go do this heist thing. I took it as he kind of crash landed and then had to maneuver from there. And winds up.
But yeah, he's wired himself so he can basically shoot his personality into the next person he encounters, because he's an old man and doesn't know if he'll be able to pull off this whole mission that he's on.
Yeah, so he puts himself in the body of this butler. So before I get into the identity questions that fascinate me so much, I'm curious about why that narrative structure of jumping from the Eugene to all of a sudden we're off on this brick block guy, and we're on brick block for like 3 issues, and then Eugene like shows up kind of as a counterpoint for me to all the identity stuff later on. But that structure fascinated me, and I wonder what motivated that like abrupt switch to a totally different story.
So initially this whole series was going to be a series of, I had this idea that I was kind of puttering around for years that was basically like putting out, I have a lot of unpublished short stories or kind of out of print short stories, and so I wanted to find a way to just do a monthly and put those in there, and it was just going to be called Brandon Graham Comics, and it was going to be like 50 pages every month, and I had like hundreds and hundreds of pages that I could just put in it. But kind of as I was working on this, I felt like it kind of turned into one big, it changed in a bunch of ways. Like my publisher at Image recommended, like a lot of it would just be kind of shifts in publishing, where he'd be like, I think this will work better if you do it as one story, or like originally it was going to be quarterly 50-page issues, and I was going to keep it going. So that was another interesting thing about it, is that even how long it was going to be and the format of it changed as I was mid drawing it. So yeah, it's like I have a hard time even remembering what a lot of my motivations were. And it's also a really weird book for me, because I think the kind of depression that I was in fucks with your memory too. And yeah, so it was this weird process of it. I was also like going to therapy while I was working on it, and doing it's just this. I feel like I've set up the kind of life where I do not have a like financial or creative choice to not do comics all the time. So it's possibly a book made in a time that I should have not been working, as weird as that sounds, but maybe for the better.
Yeah, I mean, I think it works out. it makes it a very powerful book, and this is where the book gets fascinating, really fascinating to me, is it's obvious to me that there was, especially now that you're saying you're going to therapy and stuff, there was this effort in your own life to evolve yourself. And brick block, by being put into a new body, gets to confront this issue of the continuity of identity, basically.
Sure.
And so he says, I'm still brick block, I'm still me, I still have work to do, I can only go forward. But it would almost be nice to let it all go, forget everything I am, and basically become something new. But then he says that's just not for me, which I think is so fascinating, because it's like there is this idea of personal identity as a total blank slate in our society. There's kind of this postmodern idea that we can constantly reinvent ourselves without an acknowledgement of someone who's going to reinvent themselves is at their core a type of person who's going to want to do that. So there is a blank, there isn't a blank slate, there is something core. And here the brick block is saying, like, I'm not the type of person, like that is at my core, I can't really do that. So I'm curious about like you coming to this, your personal kind of journey of reinvention, how that influenced your outlook on identity that shows up in the book, and anything along those lines.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it gets really complicated. A lot of it's kind of figuring out. I mean, because aside from depression, I also was dealing with a lot of people. I had big falling out online. I had Twitter mad at me for a while, which is a thing I kind of talk around a lot. But so a lot of it was like my reputation taking a big hit, and me being kind of a public figure and trying to talk about if people are presenting an idea of you that you do not feel is you, and you can't correct strangers' narrative of you. How do you kind of continue to engage with the community and with yourself as being at all public and be honest about things, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
You got the scenes with the I hadn't twigged on that as a undercurrent, except for the scenes with the mob. You get the upper class mob taking pleasure in lambasting a poor other member of the class who's fallen out of favor temporarily.
Yeah, and there's a lot of that kind of Kafka. And something I don't know if you noticed about that scene is those are the main two characters are asterisk characters. It's Obelix and the Cacophonist.
I didn't notice that. It's great.
That was another thing is I was becoming incredibly disenchanted with kind of the comics community that I'd spent my life in. And one of the ways that I was dealing with that while still figuring out how to love comics again was I was going backwards, and like I read through all of Tintin and I was reading through all of Asterix. I got really fascinated by Hergé's life. A big aspect of Hergé's life is that he was essentially canceled after World War II for continuing to work on a kind of German Nazi run, like the children's edition of that. And it was this thing where he was essentially blacklisted and had to kind of re-engage with Tintin again. And I really liked, he's one of the only cartoonists I can think of that had such a fall from grace. And I might have rose-colored glasses of Hergé, but I think his work really evolved as he got older, and he would go back and even change older work, which is something that I don't do, because I think that you have to, I think of art kind of as a diary. Like you leave your diary alone and you work on the next chapter,
Right. I don't know if you've ever read P.G. Wodehouse, but Wodehouse had a sort of similar fall from grace in that he was, during World War II was inside of occupied country. I don't remember if it was Austria, and he gave some broadcasts as an occupied person, as a foreign citizen living in this country, occupied by the France, occupied by the Germans, and his broadcasts were totally banal. It was just basically like, well, being imprisoned is not quite as bad as you imagine, because you can still do some stuff. And he spent the rest of his life trying to live down, essentially like remarks made by a, just totally a prisoner of war,
Right, totally. Yeah, and we're in a very weird time now where social media is kind of, people are looking for villains to put on trial, and there's not really a way back for it, and there's a lot of it that doesn't really require evidence or a court system or any of the things that you would expect. So yeah, it creates this very, and I imagine it's funny to think of World War II as like what are the casualties of people, and this goes back to the theme of Reverend Like Hammers, is the idea of somebody doing something that is essentially they're doing it for noble reasons, but it's hurting other people, or it's casualties of someone trying to do the right thing.
Right.
Certainly. Like we talked before recording, I was talking about there's a Watchmen TV series that got lots of praise, and I was really fascinated by reading interviews with the guy, because the guy who was the showrunner on the thing, because he was fully aware that Alan Moore, who wrote Watchmen, did not want him to make a TV show, but he had this idea that it was morally necessary for him to do this thing and talk about racism. So it was like him doing a moral stance for people that have not asked for it,
Right.
while essentially harming or going against the wishes of the person that he's pulling the ideas from. And so really fascinated the mental gymnastics in that, and I see a lot of that in comics, and I see, you know, I often talk about how I think we're in an anti-art era in comic books, unfortunately,
Mm-hmm.
and it's very frustrating that craft and beauty of art does not supersede, you know, the dumb posturing of the internet, you know.
Right. Well, and it's funny, you talk about a symphony or something. I mean, how long do you talk about thematic development of a symphony? You know, you're talking about the notes that they're playing. I mean, a comic is not a novel, and a comic is not a didactic tract that somebody wrote down. And, you know, a comic is a visual experience that is only partially made up of its themes. I mean, you could theoretically have a great comic that was, I mean, you know, actually morally repugnant or something, and still have it be something that was, you know,
Yeah, I mean, even the
of
idea
value.
that art should be an expression of morality, that artists need to be moral, I find incredibly distasteful. I don't think you, you know, I did it. I saw somebody just kind of flapping their gums about how they are not interested in seeing art by people that have hurt people. And I was looking at my bookshelf and I was just like, I have been pulled out of some serious rough times by like Charles Bukowski work, or you know, like a huge amount of stuff where I'm just like, I do not. I'm pretty sure that person has probably like hit people and certainly yelled at them and everything, but how do they pull themselves out of that? And the idea that somebody should be like invented in a vat and pulled out and be perfectly perfect to never make a mistake and never misstep is it's very anti-art.
Right.
And
Well, and how do you like qualify or quantify hurt people?
yeah,
Like,
that's another
what
thing.
human being are you going to find on the face of this planet that hasn't hurt someone in some interpretation of that word, like personally, emotionally,
Yeah,
made a
and
rude comment? Like,
totally, and we keep going back to these things that essentially come at, like, we have a criminal justice system, you know,
Yeah.
where it's very fascinating, because I feel like I'm just kind of engaging. It's a large topic, but just engaging with the community, and I have, you know, people that I communicate with that have been basically like excommunicated and dropped from their jobs because people have decided they're bad people, and I think that the comics community has a bit of a responsibility to not abandon the people who are, you know, who are part of this community in any sense. You know, I have very complicated feelings about, and they're not that complicated. I have a lot of conversations about Dave Sim because I understand that he is not an easy person to get along with, but I also think that there's value in his work that if people care about comic books is really worth engaging. And I don't think that his belief system or personal life necessarily needs to even come into the conversation when you're talking about his storytelling. And it's important to the medium.
Yeah, I would sign off on everything you just said, except for the difficult part, which you know, if you as a personal relationship, you know, he's always been nothing but kind and gracious to me.
Oh, sure.
But
and I don't,
yeah.
and I'm not even speaking from personal experience. I've met him twice, and he was super pleasant to me.
Just art for art's sake. This page just killed me. This whole spread, and this character. Who, you know, I apologize for not remembering everyone's names. Would you refresh?
I don't remember everyone's names. That guy's name is, I think his name is Ott.
Ott, thank you. Ott,
does he show up here?
Who we first find playing, I'm going to call it 5-dimensional croquet. He's essentially playing croquet, except he hits 5 balls in rapid succession.
Right.
And towards the end, we actually are given justification for the earlier gratuitous croquet scene that you have so wantonly afflicted on us. So first off, I wanted to know your crimes against humanity for bringing croquet into comics. Are you aware of prior croquet use in comics?
I have a golf manga that I do not know the name of that is possibly one of the most prized possessions, and it's so beautifully done. And I was really frustrated with this. Oh, I should point out just before we get into the intricacies of golf comics, this scene, which I think this is the beginning of issue 4, because I'm like looking it up when there's a gigantic 4 on the screen.
I think it was 4, yeah. Pretty
this
sure.
was a really clear indication where I was like, I was starting to have fun with the book again.
Yeah.
And part of it is like this ridiculous robot, which is like a sexy typewriter, and this little this little Yoda man on an oversized sweater. I was just finally like I don't want to make it sound like I hated making these pages up to this point or anything, but I was enjoying my life again by the time I got to this. I feel like I'd worked through a lot of stuff, and just having like I switched characters again. You get a big focus on these characters for the beginning of this issue. And a lot of it was me just being like, how do I leave the baggage behind of this stuff and just focus on that? And a lot of it is just like, I was having a lot of conversations in the comic where people are talking about the idea of self and their identity and everything. And I just wanted to show this very tactile, simple thing of like I just enjoyed the golf manga, and I was like, I just want to draw a little golf scene. That'd be nice. And then I basically, as I kept working on the comic, I worked it into it actually having a reason at the end.
Right. Yeah, which is fantastic. And you're that was what I was getting at before, what the responsive art making, and that I felt like I could see you grasping for that earlier thread and being like, oh, there it is, and pulling on it like a lifeline and attaching it to the other segments that were there. And your architectural instincts had furnished you with several other things that enable that structurally to work perfectly. I mean, it's shocking. It's great that you had it serialized like that, and we're able to connect those threads together. But yeah, this whole segment here blew me away, and really enjoyed the way that it comes back later. Not gonna say too much about it at the moment, but I also just wanted to remind you that Croquet was definitely in the second volume of Cerebus.
Oh, right, of course.
So
outside of the Regency.
Right, exactly. So probably should stay away from it in future
I don't want to be associated with the bad man.
Yes, because only
bad game.
Social reprobate misogynists play croquet.
It's funny that I waited to bring in the sexy assistant and tell the croquet too. Something interesting about the series too is I was my work is really like, aside from puns, I also get associated with just drawing like porn comics and naked ladies a lot. And this comic, there's like it is a eunuch's it is sexless until that character shows up. And so it was very freeing for me to kind of suddenly be like, okay, I'm gonna draw this weird sexy robot that doesn't really serve any purpose in the story. And like I have these things where like she's like walking, he's riding her like a pony, and the sound effects are like sexy clip, sexy clop, and just letting myself just get ridiculous with it.
And he's really kind of like, if I remember, he's kind of like humping her face while he's typing the keyboard, like he's kind of on the front of it.
Yeah.
Actually, that brings up something else I wanted to talk about. And I disagree that you hadn't had sexy stuff until then, because I had this sequence that I had pulled out, and I do, because I've seen a lot of I've looked at, I think, all of your work, but especially some of the earlier stuff, which is straight up porn comics, and you've had that aspect, and you do draw like a lot of sexy girls. And it seemed like in dealing with this thing you went through where you had Twitter come after you, I don't know, like this to me, like this guy dealing with this body is a nightmare, spoke to like how, especially these days, I could imagine there's a lot of blowback of doing pornographic comics and doing images like that of women, and how the culture could make you feel like guilty for a totally physical reaction or response to something. And Dave has got the blowback the other way, like like he'll say, I don't have anything wrong with people being gay, but I can't help like kind of
being heterosexual.
me being repressed or kind of just naturally disgusted at the idea of two guys fucking. Just
there's a bit of narcissism in that, because it's like most people, I don't really, if I look out my window, I'm like, I don't want to see those people fucking, you know. It's like a lot of it's like, that's none of your business. But I mean, I guess he's honest.
yeah, so it's this weird thing where like struggling against this body is a nightmare, and being embodied and having to deal with things that you're being told are maybe inappropriate.
Yeah, I mean, comics isn't I mean, aside from being anti-art, it's very puritanical right now, and that is worth pushing back. I think one of my worries is I'm going to go full Manara next, because everyone is so scared of sex that I'm just like, I have a really hard time with the idea that the lines that you draw on paper for fiction are harmful. And it just does not, my brain does not work that way. I just feel like I'm, you know, to go back to that fine film Zoolander, I feel like I'm taking crazy pills, you know. Yeah. And it's just, I think that, you know, there's a big pushback in recent years against Robert Crumb's work. And I think what Robert Crumb did wrong was he was honest about his real feelings. And I think that is one of the big purposes of art, to express things that are actually happening in your brain. And I think one of the weird things about me is I don't think I go that dark, really. So I'm almost envious of Crumb's weird fetishes and stuff, because I'm like, I just want to draw pretty girls.
Right.
But it does make me want to push back and have more fun drawing sex and kind of put that out more, because I think it's before we started talking, I was saying that this is one of the weirdest times in my art career, because it's the first time that you can really, it's so easy to be subversive now, because you have so many people that are just looking to be so mad about everything. And so if you know, like I could draw a picture of, I don't know, Angel McSpade in the pose of Spider-Gwen. You know, that's probably a dated idea now. And it's not that exciting of an idea for me, and I don't really want to draw it, but that would ruin my career. I would not get another job if I drew that picture. And I think that's so dumb, because it's like, I don't honestly believe that a human being would be hurt by that drawing. I think people would be it, and they'd be like, this guy seems like an asshole that he would spend 6 hours drawing a racist caricature sexy. I don't think anyone would like it either, you know?
So there was never a point where you were at conflict with that, because like in that scene I wondered, like he seems at conflict with these urges. Like you were always pretty firm in your like, yeah, fuck you guys, like art is art.
I mean, I've spent a lot of time, and especially with my kind of therapy, I've spent a lot of time trying to roll around the idea of seeing sides of it and everything. And I don't know, maybe it's dishonest to say that I've tried to seriously consider it, because it does really change the game when you're like, you know, I had somebody write me a letter that they thought that it was inappropriate that I was sharing Milo Manara's work. And I want to be like a good person and be like, I'm sorry, but my gut reaction is like, fuck you, this is important to me. And I do not see how, you know, they don't have anything to stand on, where it's just like, yeah. And the internet's leveled the playing field in a weird way. I remember when, not to go back to it too much, but I remember when Manara's Spider-Gwen, when everyone got incredibly mad at that, and you had these people that like, I was amazed that they could fucking hold a pen with their with their inarticulate fingers, doing redraws of Milo Manara work, and being like, this is how you'd fix this drawing, you know. It's just like, I like don't think, yeah,
the anatomy lessons that were going on online.
Yeah, and anatomy lessons from people that like, you know, could not, you know,
aren't fit to wash his brush.
Yeah, aren't fit. Yeah, people that I'm not to get too angry, but I'm like, I'm mad that they know his name, let alone that they think that they can critique his work, you know.
Well, people might think that this is a you know, depressed, alternately depressed or angry screed. Listening to you know, a few minutes of this, you know, really engaging science fiction, very interesting questions of identity. Some of the things that we were talking about in Appleseed, I think rearing their heads here, and I was very intrigued by Brick Block. Mm-hmm. This is why I keep on getting tripped up by his name, by the way, Brandon. You're asking me to swap my R and my L.
I know. I'm sorry.
Alternately, his transfer back into another body leaves his previous host still feeling like himself. And I think that that's not too much of a spoiler to say that that is something that's going on with some of the other characters as well, in the other identity transfers. And
this ties back into Prophet too, where they had I was dealing with like multiple, like there's thousands of clones based off the same person, and so it's kind of a running theme in a lot of my comics. Sorry to cut you off.
Oh no! Yeah, I don't want to cut off your question to give you actual information. What I was wondering is if that was related to the previous thing that we accidentally cut you off on, talking about the professors of was it neuroethics or neurophilosophy?
Yeah.
And whether that identity question was something that came out of your discussions with them, or something that you've been thinking about, independent of that.
Yeah, no, I mean, it probably came. I mean, this was like 7 years ago that I would talk to them about this stuff, but a lot of it is just the idea of self and how much your self can change by, like even like people that take antidepressants, like that kind of make you a different person or make you a better person, or the idea of, what little things make us us. And it was really interesting. And something I wanted to play with in Rain Like Hammers is the idea of Brick Block leaves his body and becomes it goes in this butler body that kind of informs, and he's fighting against what this kind of butler's genetically engineered urge to serve the people that he was created by. He actually starts taking, he has this drug bug that he starts smoking. And a lot of that was, I had avoided really I was always very smug about not really drinking or using drugs or anything the vast majority of my life, because I was always, art's always associated with like, man, you must have been really high when you did this. And I was like, no, I was sober in a room, caffeine or whatever. But a lot of it, when I started dealing with depression and trauma to some extent, is actually like started smoking weed for the first time and actually saw the benefits of it as like I did a diary comics on my Instagram, which basically talks about like how I was using it to basically combat depression and not just getting stoned, but the idea of you getting into a different mind state. And I've had this with mushrooms too, where you get into a different mind state. And then when you sober up, your problems that you hold on to and carry around along, just that you spent 6 hours without caring about those problems, it makes you realize like, I don't need to have those in my daily life. I don't need to sit around worrying about what strangers think about me, or what, some bad experience that I had several years ago. I need to be in the I can allow myself to be in the tactile moment. And it's very freeing. And so I wanted to kind of talk about that in a science fiction way in the comic, about how he's kind of dealing. And it could be weed, or it could be just antidepressants or exercise, or any of these things that we use to kind of change our brain chemistry.
And the experience of personality change, because being in a body comes with the new chemistry. So like this scene here, like all of a sudden he's saying dust tastes surprisingly good.
Oh yeah, I was thinking about what they would genetically engineer these guys who cleaned up things to actually like want to do.
But it's such a smart look at, I think, such smart look at how identity, it's such a big topic for our culture right now, like personal identity and how people frame it for themselves. And there's a lot of competing philosophies, some that I think are healthier, and some of the more popular ones I think are more personally disruptive, probably.
Oh, sure.
But a lot of it has to do with like this essential idea of the self, which kind of divorces it from the body in a way, and a realization that the identity is tied up with the entire perceptual system of the body, in like even being the type of creature who would think dust tastes good is going to inherently change you from being the type of creature that would never think to eat dust. And even though Brick Block starts out saying, no, I'm not that type of person who would change, as he goes through these physical changes, that really does change him kind of against his will in an interesting way. I really like this line too. I'm taking it out of context, and I don't know if you meant it this way. He's getting away from the the people that he serves, right? And he feels
Right.
compelled to serve them, and he loses his senses because he's taken over by the urge to serve them. But taken out of context, I really love the line, I only return to my senses once I'm away from them. And there I read it not as away from the people he's serving, but I can only return to my senses when I'm away from my senses.
Interesting.
Is an interesting thing where he can only return to his sense of who he really is once the senses that the body are forcing on him move away. So I was curious, that was not an intentional.
No, I like it. It's not intentional. It's interesting. I think when I did that, it was kind of early days and I was figuring things out. And I was very active on Twitter before I decided it was poisonous and got away with it. And it sounds really dumb, but I've come to regard it as something that is deeply unhealthy for people's mental state, because it's something that kind of rewards antagonism.
Mm-hmm.
And it was this thing, like I felt very much like, to be involved in this comics community idea, I need to have, I had to have my take on whatever anger of the day was going on social media. And it was weird. It was really disheartening how I actually cared when I got off. Like, I was like, oh, I want to be part of this Twitter conversation. And I'm like, I'm a grown man. I don't need to be on Twitter. I can read a book, but it was like breaking an addiction almost in some ways.
And so you feel like you return to your senses?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it's just like, I mean, it's weird now with how much social media and computers and everything are like become such a part of our life. Like, I think it requires a level of like, it feels like an achievement for me on days that I can like if I can leave my apartment without my phone and just be unreachable. It's funny, it feels like a moral achievement on my part, which I know is ridiculous, but a lot of that is trying to figure out how to deal with that through art.
But so there's embedded in that, I think, this idea, talking about the idea of the identity tied to the physical system that you inhabit.
Sure.
There's also the idea that our technology is quite literally just an extension of our self. Mm-hmm. And so we extend our different facilities out through technology, and that the internet would be an extension of the brain. So when you're connecting with Twitter in that way, that becomes a part of your body and it's influencing your personality. And when you disconnect it, it's almost like this scene where, like, once I disconnect from that alien body, I can return to a healthier sense of self.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, because I see a lot of things on social media where I don't have a word for it or anything. There's a type of person that acts like an insufferable human being online, and then in physical space is fine. And you can't imagine them being that antagonistic and weird, Like, there's people who I hate online, and then I know if I run into them, I'll just be like, oh, they're fine. And I think a lot of it's just that influence.
Your book makes several good arguments for a world of sensory engagement, and you both, having recently read Prophet, the first 2 volumes anyway. There are several scenes in that also have a sort of deep sensory engagement, whether he's like ripping meat off the bone, or smelling an awful smell that no one else can tolerate or whatever. It seems to me that the thing that, maybe it's, I don't want to say, the thing that moved me about the croquet scene was that he wanted to hit the ball, and it sounds petty. He's engaging physically with the actual thing. It's an interesting thing to me that you made a tactile book full of tactile things in a time of sort of remote engagement.
Well, it's funny how important that stuff. I have weird things that I do a lot. Like, I'll be like walking down the street and I'll drag my head along the wall and be like, try to remind myself I'm in the moment. Yeah. And that you don't want to get into your head so much. And reading something, it's like, it's one of the reasons why I put food in things so much. And you just, there's a level of not just spinning your wheels with ideas, but like showing real moments and real things that I feel like connects the reader too much, or connects the reader more to the work. Like, it's almost like it's more fun to draw, and it's more, and things that are relatable too. Like there's a lot of things like for years I wouldn't draw guns in the work, and it was because it was something that I didn't personally engage with. And like things like fight scenes, I try to rein them in a little bit, as much as I'm always like kind of have that action movie thing of like, this is a fun way to show this. As I want to, I think things become more real when they're things that the reader can notice that they've experienced. Yeah, maybe not croquet. I don't know if I've ever played croquet, but the idea of hitting a ball with a club does seem very satisfying.
Well, movie pitch for you. When this is inevitably made into very expensive animation that's exclusively done in the Swiss Alps, you score the entire thing with industrial noises and low, subharmonic throbbing, and then at the climactic scene, you have XTC synths working overtime, played in full.
I like that. Sold.
I can call up Andy and see if he'll give us the license.
Yeah, just get the. Yeah, it is very funny, and that is something that I think about a lot. Is in comic books, what other, like, how would you watch, like if you watched a movie and you translate it, it's something I'm kind of sad doesn't exist anymore very much, is comic book adaptations of movies. You know, in the 80s and 90s, there was lots of that. Because I think it would be really fun to try to take something from another medium and show how you would express that in just, a paper book.
Right.
It's interesting how much is going the other way now.
Right.
It's less interesting. It's like, what if we added more? It's almost like movies become, it's like you're making it easier.
Yeah, it's the IP farm storyboard, free storyboards idea.
Sure, yeah.
As opposed to the ship it with a flexi disc and pop it on your Victrola.
Yeah. And I guess it's interesting if someone, it's not like I could make a good movie, but it's also, I get into this funny argument with a friend of mine who's, he's a comic book writer that kind of came from screenwriting, and I'll always be very dismissive of movies. And the thing that I say that he hates the most, I'm just like, it's just not, if you wanted to make art, it's not the medium I would go into, because it requires so much money and so many people involved that it just, you lose control.
Right.
And you've maintained complete control.
Yeah, part of it is just like lack of choice. Like I think I have, I've been talking to a bunch of younger artists lately and almost helping them like manage their careers a little bit, as weird as that sounds. And a lot of it is just that I feel like when I broke into comics, I was so loud and obnoxious sometimes and burnt a ton of bridges that I would like to see other people not do that, because I'm of the belief now that it might be paranoia or anything, but I kind of don't necessarily trust collaboration as much, because I can do it all myself, and I don't, I don't know necessarily when someone else or someone else with money is going to pull out of a job.
But my idea of you has always been somewhat, probably because of Island, but I feel like I've just always seen you as someone who's like trying to be like, check this person out, check this person out, check. That doesn't seem like a new thing for you to me. That just seems to be like you're so excited about the medium that you just get stoked about people.
That's a big part of it, but a lot of that, kind of the end of Island, I would really ended with my disenchantment for the comics community, and a lot of it was that I felt like I was discovering people and trying to help their career, and then as soon as it was convenient, I got a lot of people that were just very shitty about me. And I am now of the belief system that, for good or ill, if you hand someone something that they haven't worked hard for, that they do not necessarily appreciate it. And that's a difficult space, because I also felt like my breaking into comics was a very hard one. Like I got my first thing published when I was 19, and I wasn't making a living off of comics until I was, around 30. And I would go to these pitch meetings with publishers, and I almost gained this this attitude where I was like, guys, you might as well let me do comics. I'm going to do them anyway. And yeah, so it's difficult, because like when I say we're in an anti-art area, it comes back to that. Like I don't think the comics community is helping artists kind of get out there, and I don't know what my role in that is anymore, because Island felt like such a, Island felt like such an attempt for me to try to build my idealized version of what comics would look like, and I felt really, yeah, I've been trying to kind of push. I've been trying to recover from how much of a disheartening experience that was. There's a lot of good came out of it. I got to some of my favorite books around Island that got collected. There's this thing that Matt Sheen and Malachi Ward did called Ancestor, and my friend Farrell's Popgun War, and Simon Roy's work here in that. But at the same time, I was like, it's hard to not sound. I really don't want to become bitter, but I have experienced the sycophant in an amazing degrees for the low level of fame that I have. As weird as that sounds.
And so has your strategy, because you say you're still trying to like support these young artists, so has your strategy changed to more like a back end, let me just give you some advice, rather than this front end, like let me give you a platform type of thing?
Well, I mean, part of it is I don't think I really have a platform in the same way that I did back then. But I mean, that's kind of my pushback against becoming cynical about that stuff, is my fear about people not having my back does not stop me from wanting to do the right thing, ideally. So I'm always having these conversations with myself of like, you know, people will be like, I don't know if this person is a great person for you to back. And I'm like, well, I think it's more important that people that are established help people than not do it, even if it's not, you know, the best case scenario in the future. Yeah, it's a struggle.
And you're constantly using Instagram. Like I'm always looking at your stories because you're always tagging a bunch of people I've never seen before. So I mean, even in that small way, it's not like you're publishing a book or something. But
yeah, it's frustrating because I love the idea of finding amazing artists and figuring out ways to throw them money, but it's not always possible. But you know, part of it is I really get a lot from kind of sharing work by other people.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons I wanted to do this. And then like I feel like right now we're in a place, because you know, I think we're still trying to grow an audience, so we have to talk about stuff that's popular. But the thing I want to do most is like talk about the shit that I'm excited about that I don't hear anyone talk about. But then you get like 5 views. So I get that excitement, and that's one of the things that I've always associated with you, is that similar excitement for just like, this is so cool, check it out. This is so cool, check it out. And
yeah, I mean, there's so much great stuff out there. Even going back, like I've been surprised at how many people haven't read Tintin, you know.
Right.
But yeah, and there's amazing new stuff being made these days too. Yeah, it's been really important to me to keep going to the comic store every week and see what's on shelves, and yeah, and keep looking for new work is really nice.
That's rare in a lot of pros now too. It's like, I don't have time, I don't read comics anymore. Like I hear a lot of people like, what are you reading now? And it's like, I don't really read that much, and that's kind of sad to me.
Yeah, I mean, part of it is just so much of my work is kind of call and response, that I almost want to, I really want to have that discover new work, and a lot of it for me lately has been going back. Like I was really amazed at how much I liked Milton Caniff's work when I got into it. And you know, I've like Paul Pope's a big influence on me, and I think Caniff is kind of like a pre-Paul Pope in a lot of ways of how he uses a brush. I don't know if we talked about it before, but it was funny reading The Strange Death of Alex Raymond, how much like Sim is he's not rooting for Caniff as much as I am, but because of his ink work, I was like, that's the guy I want to win in this. You know, that's the guy I'm rooting for.
Yeah.
Well, he had the firmest he has the firmest handshake, right?
Oh yeah, there's that panel of him like the
big black brush.
Yeah.
Squeezing down.
Yeah. Yeah. Totally. Yeah, and also I do feel like there were kind of, I mean, there's always kind of multiple sections of the comics community, but I feel like right now we have a really noticeable differentiation between what's happening on a retailer level of people going into comic stores and buying books, and what's happening online. Yeah, it's almost like 2 different scenes. Like I'm really surprised when I will see something being really pushed online that everybody is excited by, and then I like look at what the book actually sold, and I'm like, no one read that thing. and then vice versa. There'll be books, you know, like Lady Death sells so much more than anybody online acknowledges. Like,
They
you
still
can make
publish that?
what's that? Yeah, they you know, makes millions of dollars, and I think he does Kickstarters for it. But it's like, it's this weird thing where it's like there is an army of Spawn and Lady Death readers that just you would think do not exist if you looked at like what the online conversations about comics were.
Yeah, there's a reason that the Vampirella Kickstarter has 125 alternate covers or whatever. You know, they can afford to pay that many people.
Yeah, so it's very odd. And I also, yeah, it's interesting with kind of back to the Twitter thing, is I've definitely started to feel like if I'm unhappy with kind of the comics community in this thing, that it almost becomes like a conversation with history, where I want to make work for people that will discover it in 10 years, and I want to engage with work that was done like 50 or 100 years ago.
Well, I think this book is an excellent argument for that, and I would also like to point out that there is a surprise tiger.
Oh yeah.
A surprise tiger.
Sir not appearing in this zoo.
Oh yeah, and the tiger's not in the book either. That's
right, exactly.
You're a tiger. Yeah, there's an interesting cover. There's an interesting story just about how I drew the sexy robot girl. Is also, do you remember Gyro Gearloose in the Scrooge McDuck comics at all?
Yeah.
He had a little light bulb guy. That's kind of what her design was. I made like a sexy Gyro Gearloose light bulb character. So I drew her there. Yeah, I was like, I don't go that dark, and I was like, meanwhile, we need to sexualize Gyro Gearloose's light bulb.
It's a subtler darkness.
Yeah, but I drew her on the cover, like just like, this will be the picture, and then every drawing I did of her was based off of this final design that I did not do a design for or research or anything. It's kind of a weird thing that happens in comics sometimes when you're working on the page, is I'll just draw a character for first time in a panel, and then like it's not like the sketchbook version of it looks anything like that. It's just kind of finalized in the comic, and kind of allowing myself to slowly evolve characters over the course of them being in the book is something I struggle with too.
Well, that's the spray painting on your own architecture that Sean was kind of hinting at. Like there's an architecture, but then you are like freestyling.
Yeah, it's important to have fun with your own work and even kind of poke fun at your own work, I think.
Yeah, I didn't mean to impose that framework, outside framework on your book. It seemed like you have both things firing at all time,
I think that's accurate though, and it's probably true of a lot of work, because you want to, sitting with a page for 6 hours and figuring out what the storytelling is. I imagine there's certain points that everybody hits where they're just like, this is ridiculous. This page makes no sense. And you kind of like make fun of it yourself on the page.
Right. And you try not to remind yourself that someone's going to read it in 14 seconds.
I have a thing that I do that's very weird, but I imagine how many people, that used to bother me, but then I imagine how many people look at it. And if you put out a book and 6,000 people look at it for 14 seconds, then it's like amounts to the time that it took to draw it.
That's a wonderful equation. I've never thought about that.
And then you have some people that like will know your work better than you know the work, and will be like, like they have a tattoo of a drawing that you spent 4 hours on and didn't think about again.
Right. How do you feel about that?
Tattoos?
Just okay. So I'll tell you.
14 seconds.
No. The people who know the work better than you do. I'm so interested in that, because when I was like 22, I think I had some backup stories published in Kirkman's Battle Pope.
Oh, nice.
And he had published a book called Ink Punks as well, which is a collection of just guys that were online. And so I went down to San Diego, and that was like the only time I've ever sat behind a table. I was there with EJ Sue, who was another guy that was in that thing, and he went on to do the tech suit thing with Kirkman.
Oh yeah, Tech Jacket.
Yeah, Tech Jacket. So I remember sitting there with EJ, and we were just doodling because we're nobody and no one cared about us and wanted to talk to us. And I heard a guy telling Kirkman about how theologically accurate Battle Pope was. and he was sitting there like explaining to him, no, like, I don't know, I'm not a theologist, like, this is a joke book. And the guy was like persistent with him about, how, and that was the point. I went home after that and I was like, I want to do this. I'm gonna be a teacher. And I went back to college because that idea of someone like latching onto and knowing something, or thinking they know something better than I knew it, like scared the shit out of me.
That's funny because I do that to other people, so I don't think I can.
Okay.
I probably told this story a bunch, but there's things where like two of my favorite comics growing up were Zooniverse by Phil Barlow, who did a bunch of like extreme Ghostbusters art and worked in animation, like elf cartoon and things, and Adam Warren's Dirty Pair. And both of those poor men have had to sit with me going through copies of the book. Adam Warren literally did a hotel lobby. I made him sit and go through the first issue of Dirty Pair and ask him questions about every page. And he hadn't thought about it since 95 or whatever, And I got to work on an issue of Empowered, and every background character I drew as one of the characters who shows up in the background of Dirty Pair. So it's like I probably spent more time thinking about how they look and how they're drawn than he did.
So I guess we've kind of just done that to you. I'm like, you have these deep philosophical thoughts about identity, and you're like, I don't know, I was fucking depressed.
Well, it's also weird too, because Rain Like Hammers is like when something's done, it's like your brain moves on to the next project, and it's like I'm already working on this thing called The Bastard Machine now, and it's like it's funny. It's kind of a response to Rain Like Hammers because I'm doing these tight 17-page issues where Rain Like Hammers I had so much room, and I would oftentimes have these things where I was like, I have 10 more pages to fill. I guess I have to figure out something for that. Where the book I'm doing now, I'm like, I have to cut all these ideas because I cannot fit it in this small space that I've allowed myself. Yeah, so it's like your brain just kind of like I can't, I don't sit around and think about what happened in King City because like my worry is repeating myself. But past that, I want to hopefully kind of be a different artist, like evolve a little bit and not be totally immersed in what I did years ago. I feel bad for guys like Brian O'Malley with Scott Pilgrim because I don't know if he can ever get out from the shadow of that because it became a gigantic monolith compared to whatever he does next.
Right.
I'm interested then because I have the experience that usually by the end of a project, whatever questions drove me to make the work, I've resolved them before I get to the end. So I'm kind of ready to be done with it. And then, like you said, move on to the next set of questions that generated. Is there like a resolution that you could say, okay, this is the question that I was kind of grappling with, and this is what I came away from doing the project with, and then how that generated the next question that you're dealing with now? Like, is there some summary of that with Rain Like Hammers?
Yeah, it's funny. There's actually there's a sequence at the end of the book where Brickblock is repairing a kind of walking little green car machine. And while he's repairing it, the narration, I basically wrote down, I've never quite done this before. I wrote down a list of everything that I wanted to say, everything that I had to say about this book and about depression and about all the bullshit of the internet and, people giving you a bad reputation or whatnot. And I wrote it down in very clear sentences to myself. And then I was like, how do I fit this into the story? And I think some of the sentences kind of changed and some of the ideas changed. And I think in that I actually say the quote about essentially being, let me see if I can find it here. Collateral damage for noble ambitions was a very like kind of core idea of what I was struggling with. Kind of seeing how other people, like trying to figure out other people. And I think the culmination of Rain Like Hammers was really just like, you cannot have all the answers. And at some point you have to kind of move on with your life.
Yeah. The one that stuck with me, and it goes back to the physicality of the body tied to the identity. I just absolutely loved it. And it is in the last scene. So you have the Brickblock character who has become someone new in the butler. And then you even say Eugene is still just Eugene.
Sure.
And you have Brickblock who hasn't transferred, who's still being the old Brick Block. But then you're saying like he's not Brick Block anymore. He's given himself a new name. Some days it still weighs heavy on him. It can feel impossible to get out from under, but he can no longer fight like he used to. And then the thing that I just like, I took a picture of it for myself, is he left the stomach for it in his old body. And that entendre that you play there is so perfect though, because it's like, oh God, I love that line. And
oh, thank you. And something that's really important about that scene is I don't tell the reader his new name. Like it's, I don't even think I figured it out myself. It's just like one of those things. It's just like he's past that. He's past this story. Yeah, it was funny. Somebody was posting random pages from this on Tumblr, because that still exists. This, this graveyard of a website. And I reposted something, and I noticed that somebody had added a note to it that was like, I feel weird about this. This feels like he's talking about people getting mad at him on the internet. And I had a hard time not engaging with the person, just being like, no shit. Like he's supposed to just like have like this like public massive blow up interaction and just be like, anyway, on to the next thing. It's like, it's important for me to kind of not live in it, but engage with it personally and move on.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a great place. Oh.
Well, then I just wanted like one last question is, so what then did that generate, unless you don't want to give away too much about the new project, as you leave that behind, what new question did it open up that you're like, okay, now I have to grapple with this?
That's a complicated thing. I can tell you the kind of gist of the new thing. So a lot of it was born about, I was going out kind of pre-pandemic, I was going out for drinks with my publisher every Friday, and we would basically just, it was me and him and Farrell Dalrymple, just Popcorn War, and John Arcudi, who started It's Two Moons and we BPRD on stuff. And it was this great amount of people to be around and kind of talk out ideas. And we were really plunging into the depths of like the beginning of Marvel Comics, and specifically like Steve Ditko's and Stan Lee and Jack Kirby's stuff, and how they did these dense, great issues that were self-contained, and how the reader got them. Just, it's like a very like, what would make comics more fun and more engaging for people. And so I started making all these notes about like how to boil down the essence of a fun comic, where you go into the comic store and you pick up a thing and it's self-contained and it's like 17 pages, you get at the beginning and middle and end of a story. And so I came up with this idea with a character, and I was also reading Tintin at the same time. So I came up with, and there's this idea with Tintin that he has no backstory. It's really fascinating when you read all the books. He doesn't have a last name. He doesn't have parents. You see his place a little bit. Like you see him writing once in the first book, but he never again even like works as a journalist as far as I'm aware. And so I came up with this idea of this character who wears a mask all the time, and he's being blackmailed by this company that sends him missions every day through this thing called the Bastard Machine. And so he has these 17 pages to go and solve this mission. He does not know why he's doing it, but if he doesn't do it, these bad guys will come after him, and there's people that are trying to stop him, and he doesn't know what their motivations are. And all this is kind of building into the later, longer story, but a lot of it is just this mad dash of like how you do this thing, doing the next thing when you feel like you don't have an option for it. And then kind of back to the kind of puritanism of kind of online comics. His kind of friend that he starts hanging out with is a prostitute that has a different John every issue. So he's doing this mission and engaging with her, and just having fun with that. Like the first issue, she has this, he has to get out to the desert, and so he goes with her in a car, which is basically like a human car, and she has this kind of S&M relationship with it. And I do all this stuff, like she has a like the emergency brake, I just black bar and put a vein on it just to make this horrible thing, and she's like almost touching the emergency brake also. So it's this weird thing of like boiling down like what was really cool about Spider-Man issue 1, with also like what do I have to say about kind of the current climate, and what I know a lot of people that would say things like, you couldn't do a comic like that now, you couldn't make Blazing Saddles now, and I would ask them like, why not? What can't you do? And I actually have lists of things about what people talk about. And it's fascinating because I do think you can do everything. I think it's more just like people will get mad at you, but you can also not make art. Yeah.
You can also choose to not engage with the people who are making, trying to get mad at you.
Yeah, and that's a big part of it for me too. Is like it's basically like, if someone's mad at me, they essentially their engagement with me can be they can look at my Instagram or they can go to the comic store and angrily put down my comic. They don't get to talk to me. You know?
Right. Exactly
Well,
right. Nobody has a constitutional right to invade your brain.
Yeah. Paul Pope actually says a lot. He's like, you don't get to meet Mick Jagger.
It's fucking true. That's a thank you, Paul Pope.
Yeah, not to compare myself to that, but Paul Pope is our Mick Jagger. I can say that.
I'm glad that you still have your stomach, or you found your new stomach to go ahead and do that brave thing, you know, like you do have the stomach for the fight still.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways it's a gift that we're in an era that you can still, you know, I don't know, it's important to me to be subversive, and thank God that that people are so dumb that it becomes easier to be subversive in dumb times.
And thank goodness the internet allows people to make a directly reach a few thousand people that can then support you directly. You know.
Oh, certainly, yeah, that's really important.
It's the distribution system that we have right now is just as remarkable as the bizarre mob.
Yeah, we live in fascinating times. What's the line? May you live in interesting times.
Right. May you live in interesting times. The book is Rain Like Hammers. This is my second copy. My first one had a giant tire mark across the cover.
It's a ride or die book.
It was a 1-of-1 special trademark edition.
Nice.
And thank you so much for talking to us, Brandon.
Yeah, thank you guys so much.
Yeah, appreciate it. And I really look forward to the new work. I really look forward to seeing all the different ways you're going to try and piss us off.
Hopefully it'll be fun. I think it'll be fun. I'm trying to have fun next.